Welcome to another episode of Healthy Thriving Family After Divorce. I'm Stephanie Dobson, your host and founder and CEO of Up a Notch Learning Inc. I'm pleased to bring with you yet another guest who will bring us positive and constructive ideas, skills, and tools to help you in your quest to be a healthy, thriving family after divorce. I'm pleased to have with me today Debra Vey Voda-Hamilton, who spent 30 years as a litigation lawyer, but has moved into her role as a full-time mediator and conflict coach for people in disputes over animals. She's the host of a popular podcast, Why Do Pets Matter? And the weekly MAAP community call, which helps pet owners navigate their journey their pets take when they can't care for them. She has been featured on the Today Show, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Huffington Post, and many other top-rated media outlets. She is the author of Nipped in the Bud, Not in the Butt: How to Use Mediation to Resolve Conflicts Over Animals, and is renowned nationwide for forging new frontiers to help pet owners, pet service providers, and those passionate about animals who find themselves embroiled in conflict live more peacefully with and for animals. She helps everyone remain focused on the best outcome for the animals and themselves. Welcome, Debra.
Hey, Stephanie, thank you so much for having me here. I'm so excited to have this conversation because where animals are concerned, especially if you want a healthy, thriving family after divorce, the animals are sometimes such an overlooked piece of that discussion. So I'm so glad you're bringing this to the people who are listening to your podcast, because they're probably wondering, oh my God, I never thought of that.
Exactly why I have you here. Thanks, Debra. So today, Debra and I will be talking, just as Debra described, about resolving pet disputes between separating and divorcing families. This is such a huge issue, as you mentioned, Debra, for people as they transition into two homes, and our pets are such a beloved part of our household. Let's dig in to get Debra's perspective on how to best handle these post-separation issues around pets. So let's get started. When families are separating or divorcing, of course, often a pet is involved, and sometimes a decision is very natural for a family as to who will keep the pet in their home, and other times it creates major conflict between the parties as to whether the pet will be shared or who will keep the pet full time. Let's start by talking about those inherent challenges in conflicts over pets in the context of separation and divorce.
Well, when people acquire a pet, they never have that conversation that says, well, if something happens and we aren't together again, I'm going to take the pet, or we're going to really endeavor to share the pet. It's never a conversation they have. And sometimes those discussions, once divorces or separations, relationship breakups happen, that conversation is fraught with conflict and just a sense of no way, no how. I've found that to be part of what I face when I help people resolve these conflicts. And I start every one of my discussions with my clients, who are the entire group, separating or a relationship breakup, saying, unfortunately, your pet doesn't hate your ex. That would be really lucky and great, because then you could easily say, the dog doesn't even like you, I'll keep it. Some people do say that. And quite frankly, the dog doesn't dislike the other party. They might like you better because you're the one who feeds them. But if you weren't home, they absolutely want to see that other party. I often say there are the dogs that love spending half their day with their triathlete mothers, and the other half of the day drinking beer and having Cheetos with their football watching father. And that is a life they both enjoy. And then there's the children. So yeah, this isn't as easy a question as you might think it should be or would be.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In your book, we talked about it a moment ago, Nipped in the Bud, Not in the Butt: How to Use Mediation to Resolve Conflicts Over Animals. You describe mediation as a way to resolve all sorts of animal disputes, and you describe that mediation elevates a pet from property status to child status. Can you help our viewers understand what mediation is and why it's particularly effective in the context of disputes over pets in a separation or divorce?
Well, mediation is a process that is user driven. So the parties who are involved are driving the discussion, and the mediator is simply supposed to be there to help you have that conversation in a less destructive manner. not to be so defensive or reactive, but really focus on what is in the best interests of the pet. The law doesn't take that into consideration. Some states have some laws that see the pet as more than property. However, when you're having these discussions, it's so much better to be outside of court, talking to each other, understanding the needs and wants of the pet and the people with respect to the pet. So mediators are uniquely qualified, although most want to run with their hair on fire. I'll tell you that, Stephanie, because no one wants to get involved with that emotional discussion over the animal. That's why my office is so busy, because they give me that one piece. It is really emotional, because when you're going through a separation or divorce, if you have children or you don't have children, losing that animal is huge. Keeping that animal becomes really important. And we sometimes lose focus on what we agreed to when we got the animal, how it's supposed to happen when we break up, what's in the best interest of the pet. So mediators help you take a step back, breathe, and really think about what is in the best interests of a pet that is property in most states, but that really 90% of people who are polled say is a member of my family and my companion.
Yeah, and as you said, it makes it so difficult when there's not when there's nothing that is set in stone as far as how to deal with disputes over pets. But yet, so many families have them, and most, as you say, don't talk at the outset of what are we going to do in the event that we separated. And I've read some cases with respect to pet disputes, and people talk about, I did this with the pet, or this was my responsibility, or this is why I want the pet. And it makes for such a really difficult discussion for judges, when at the end of the day, what we really want is to help to make the best decision for the pet.
Right. You're so right. Because what happens when you go and buy the dog for your wife for her birthday, your name is on the sales slip. And now, the dog is your wife's, but you have the property ownership because you bought it, you paid for it. Your name might be at the vet's office. Her name might be at the vet's office. If you're living together and you're just in a relationship, most of this is split. Most of the money is split, but it might not be reflected anywhere. And let me tell you, if my name is on that piece of paper, I'm going to say I own that dog because my name's on this piece of paper. And in a court of law, that's what's going to rule the day. However, you all know that you had that conversation at the shelter, at the breeder, that you were going to share this dog. And what you need to do is be able to go back there, go back to that time when you got involved, when you bought the dog together, and how you felt at that time. It's difficult to do when you're in the throes of a relationship breakup or divorce. That's why I always suggest when you get the dog, write down what I call a touchstone. Where's this dog going to go if something happens to our relationship? Let's think about it now, because I will hold fast to this, Stephanie, that we will share this dog 3 months on, 3 months off, even if we, have an ugly breakup, because both of us understand that this dog is ours, not just yours because you paid for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so true. Further into the mediation context, you have an acronym in your book that describes the goals of mediation, which you describe as AKA squared, which stands for address, keep, acknowledge, and appreciate. Can you walk our viewers through this?
So when you're having a disagreement and you're both on opposite sides of the discussion, if you can stop, and instead of being defensive and reactive and making sure that you get your point across, stop and appreciate the other person's point of view. And appreciate doesn't mean that you agree. It simply means that you appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
And acknowledging that person's point of view and saying, Stephanie, I really acknowledge that that's how you feel today. And that's how you believe we both felt then. And I want to appreciate that, you have the ability to feel that way, and then decide whether or not you want to keep going in this discussion, keep going in this relationship with respect to the pet or not. Because sometimes it is often better for the pet for someone to walk away. And that is a very difficult thing to do. However, if we are entrenched or we're facing someone who's entrenched, sometimes deciding whether or not to keep the relationship going to share the pet or not to keep the relationship is one of the decisions you have to do. And acknowledging the baggage that you're bringing into the conversation is very important as well. Because if you only want to keep this pet because you know how much it means to the other party, or if the pet would be better off with the other party, but you love it and you care for it, then think of an alternative. Acknowledge that the dog might be better with you. Let's talk about if, in fact, you go on vacation, or if, in fact, something happens to you, that we sign a document that says Stephanie will call Debra no matter what if she can no longer take care of Fluffy. That gives you incredible peace of mind that if I've had cases like this, so I want your listeners to understand and believe. Someone is awarded the dog and then drops it off at a shelter because they never wanted it. They just didn't want Stephanie to get it. So if you do decide to give your dog to the other party because it might be better off, sign a document that says, in the event you can't keep this dog, I'm the first person you call. You have to call me. Because if the dog had to choose, I always laugh when Judge Judy's on TV and she brings the dog in and it runs to Stephanie. Well, if Stephanie wasn't in the room, she'd run to me. And so if something happens to Stephanie, that would give that person the ability to get the dog back, and the dog would get someone they know. The other good part of appreciating, acknowledging, and addressing the issues and whether or not to keep it is you have a second set of financial abilities to help the dog if you keep those doors open. So not only do you want to make sure that if something happens to the other party who might keep the pet, that they would call you, but if something happens to the pet and they can't afford to care for it, that you've left that door open. That is never left open when you go to court. It is cut and dry. Stephanie gets it. We really hope, Stephanie, that you'll share it with Debra, but the dog is yours. And that really leads to a lot of heartache.
Mm-hmm. And it's so important to appreciate one of the things that you're talking about, which is creativity of solutions, and to keep the parties in the driver's seat as to finding those solutions and to brainstorming together. And that's part of mediation, is coming together, talking, doing all of the things that you're talking about, trying to brainstorm all of the different solutions. And it may be that one person keeps the dog primarily, but there's extra alternatives, like when there's a vacation, or 1 month a year, or in the event that you can't keep the dog, then, or the pet, this is what would happen. And so that's really what I see mediation can. One of the great benefits of mediation is being able to work together to figure out some outside of the box thinking, we'll call it.
Yeah, and it actually gives the animal a voice in the room, because I'm going to sit there and say, well, what would Fluffy really want to do if you aren't around? Who would Fluffy go to? And what usually happens is they go to anybody but Stephanie. However, when we get past that anger and that hurt, because this is a really rough time in your life. This is not a happy time that you're, trying to split the dog up. It's a rough time in your life. Whatever happened that precipitated the relationship breakup, the divorce, is always in the background of this conversation. And I try to not bring it in, but of course it's part of the conversation. Mm-hmm. And what happens to the pet is something that is uniquely able to be facilitated positively through mediation, because the mediator isn't telling you what to do. They are helping you decide what is in the best interest of everyone. And so if they're brainstorming with you, they should be holding a safe space for everyone's point of view, everyone's ability to share the dog or not share the dog, and then take time off if you need to and come back, because sometimes these decisions, I can tell you that I usually don't mediate longer than 2 or 3 hours with people over animals, because to speak about an animal, whether you're going to get it or lose it, is sort of like your children, some of the most emotional conversations you're going to have, especially now post-COVID.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love the technique that you describe in your book called Stop, Drop, and Roll as a tactic that's used in mediation. Let's talk a little bit more about that.
So I have to tell you that I came up with that because when my clients are in conflict, it's as if they're on fire. There is the flames are going 100 miles an hour and nobody knows how to put them out. So I always say, if you can remember, when you were in grammar school and the fireman came in and said, stop, drop, and roll, that was supposed to save your life. Well, now when you're in conflict over an animal, be it divorce, landlord, tenant, breeder, owner, handler, so many areas of conflicts that arise over animals, just remember this: stop, drop, and roll, easy, quick, stop talking and listen. First of all, they can't hear you. They're on a roll. And if you're trying to talk over them or talk after them or convince them, it's sort of like trying to convince anyone on Facebook of a point of view. Not going to happen. So just stop talking and listen. And when you're listening, do what I usually tell my clients to do, is loop back and say, Stephanie, I just heard you say this, this, and this. Did I get that right? And if I didn't, could you let me know what I got wrong? And they will stop railing at you because you're not talking to them or at them or around them. You're actually listening for understanding and not response, which all of us do. We just listen for response. I'm doing that here when I talk with you. I'm listening for response. But when we're in a conflict, we really should listen first for understanding. So if you stop talking, it really helps you listen more deeply. If you drop the need to be right, my new mantra is, I want to get it right. I don't want to be right. I used to say that, if you stop trying to be right, you're going to be righter, because you're going to listen to everything Stephanie says and you're going to focus on the things you agree with. So Fluffy's a great dog. Fluffy loves us both. Fluffy needs somewhere to live going forward. Those are three things we all agree on. What that means and how that looks is what we disagree on. But if we can start focusing on how much we love Fluffy, how we both want to find what's best for Fluffy going forward, and Fluffy needs that direction in its life, then you're starting on the positive. So drop the need to be right and really look for the common ground that you can focus on first. Because if you walk in with the common ground, then the more difficult conversations get a little easier. And the last piece, which is roll. So when the firemen were coming in, they got you on the carpet, you were rolling around so you didn't burn up. Well, I always say, let everything roll off your back. But they say things that are just, how could I let that go, Debra? Why can't I respond to that? Well, it's not in the best interest of Fluffy. It's really in the best interest of you getting even with Stephanie. However, not really in the best interest of Fluffy. So let it go. And what I have found, which is unbelievable and across the board true, if you let somebody talk and say all these things, and you stop talk and listen, you drop the need to be right, and you reflect back what they're saying instead of telling them what your opinion is or how wrong they are. If you let it roll off your back, all the time, I get calls from clients who say, my God, I stopped, dropped, and rolled. And they did come back and apologize because they just were having a bad day, an out-of-body experience. And maybe later you can walk up to Stephanie and say, listen, I understand that you were having a really bad time with our discussion. Can you tell me a little bit more about it? You let it roll off your back. You haven't come up to tell them how bad and terrible they are. And you can then have a positive conversation. And that's why I always love mediation, because we always let things roll off our backs because we want to make sure we have the information at hand that's going to benefit the animal.
And to me, some of this principle goes back to the idea of validating what someone is saying. And it doesn't necessarily mean responding and agreeing and carrying that on. But if you, as you were describing, if the listener can loop back and confirm that they've understood, so much of when you're angry and you're going on this, long monologue, I should say, I suppose, and the other person is just simply listening, just the person who's angry to have someone, the listener, to loop back and just to validate or acknowledge or
appreciate,
understand exactly what they're saying can diffuse the situation more than responding, as you're describing.
Well, it's interesting because I often say that most of my listeners will never say they will understand Stephanie's point of view because she's crazy, and they're never going to understand, but they can appreciate that she can have a different point of view. And my mantra is the only thing that agree and appreciate have in common are the letters A, R, E. And we are going to work this out if we stop, drop, and roll. And if we AKA, if we acknowledge, appreciate, decide whether or not we're going to keep this relationship going or stop it, and acknowledge and appreciate the end game as well.
Mhm, mhm. We talked a moment ago about the courtroom and how disputes over pets are not a good place to, it's not good to go to the courtroom for that. You highlight in your book a specific case, 2013 case out of New York State called Travis and Murphy. Let's talk a little bit about that case and the challenges that can come with litigating animal disputes more generally.
Well, Travis v. Murray was a case that had a same-sex couple breaking up, and the moneyed spouse had bought the dog. That's why I used it as a example uh, for the non-moneyed spouse, and the non-moneyed spouse spent most of the time with the pet. So the court said, well, clearly the dog belongs to the non-moneyed spouse. And when I posted after that decision came down and the dog was awarded to the non-moneyed spouse, and the judge did say, I hope you both can work out some way to allow the other party to see the dog. I said, well, you didn't really leave that door open, because here they both spent tens of thousands of dollars to try to get the dog to be theirs. One lost, one won. And when you have that win-loss, you have that binary discussion, it is almost impossible to build trust to share. So going forward, even though the judge might say, well, I hope you'll let them see it, unlikely. The other piece that really bothers me about the binary discussion and the win-lose is that if the dog gets sick, who is the non-moneyed spouse going to call? And I had a number of notes on my Facebook post in 2013 when I put that up that said, well, if the moneyed spouse really loved the dog, they would pay for its care. And I'm sure they would. I don't know. I'm just proffering that if they have no ability to see the dog, spend time with the dog, have the dog in their life, why should they feel, or do they need to feel, that they can be called to pay for its medical care? Most people will, because that's just the kind of humans we are, because we love our animals. However, that wasn't left as a possibility. And when, if the judge had been able, but you're not in court, to offer that opportunity where if something happens to you, I get the dog. If the dog gets sick, I agree to help you pay for it or whatever. Sometimes people don't ever want that. I have enough money. I don't want any money from you. Well, you never know what's going to happen. I mean, we had COVID. How many people lost their jobs? So you always want to leave that door open and leave the possibility. I don't know about you, Stephanie, but my dogs hate going to the kennel when I go on vacation. So leave the possibility that if I go on vacation, that you're the first person I'm going to call. And if you can take the dog, great. And we've agreed that if you take the dog, you return the dog, and that's in writing. So that's enforceable. However, the dog gets to stay with Stephanie once or twice a year and for a week. I remember one of my fine colleagues in collaborative law said to me after I did a radio interview with her, she said, I spoke to my husband, my ex-husband, 10 years after we divorced. And he said, the one thing he regretted giving me full custody of was the dog. And it's because nobody ever talks about it. They just decide the dog will be better off with the wife, and that's that. Well, if you can have that conversation, which is why mediation is such a great platform on which to really foster it. If you can have that conversation where the dog does get to go back and forth in some fashion, it really benefits the pet. Because unfortunately, your pet doesn't hate your ex, as I said before.
Yeah, and when we loop children into there, so often the pet is the children's pet, and it's attached to the children. And so if you can do something, again, talking about the creativity of solutions is doing something with respect to when the children go back and forth, to have, there be some continuity there with the pet, can also be very beneficial.
Well, that's a question that should be discussed among the exes, because sometimes it is really important for the pet to spend some time with the ex that doesn't have the children, because of that immediate loneliness. I have never been alone without the children before, and both spouses feel that way. So the pet can sometimes buffer that, so the parent will get the kids and they can go on vacation, and then the pet stays with the ex, or stays with the ex for a day or two and then goes over, so that animal is always there as a comfort. And if we can see that instead of as a bludgeoning, it works out a lot better.
Yeah, it's very clear from our discussions how beneficial working together without the initial ruling or final ruling, shall we call it, of a courtroom. Because as you describe in Travis and Murphy, the challenge can really be if you try to come to mediation once a decision has been made, you really are behind the eight ball right from the get-go, and the one spouse feels entitled and the other spouse feels unentitled. And so it makes it for a much more difficult discussion at the mediation table.
Well, the mediation would come before the decision because mediation gives you the opportunity to litigate if you can't work it out. So you always want to mediate first. Often people will go to mediation once litigation starts before it goes to trial. So in that pre-trial stage, they might say, well, let's mediate the question about the dog. If you can mediate even before litigation, all the disagreements, that's fabulous. But at least the dog, pull it out, mediate it, and then come to the table, because I know that I've had many colleagues who are litigators in divorce law who thought they had a fabulous agreement hammered out, and then they got to the pet and it went into the toilet, as I said, because they just could not agree on who would get the pet. And yet they could agree on the children, they could agree on the silverware, they could agree on everything, but not who got the pet, because this is a living, breathing animal that I spend my mornings with because I'm a stay-at-home mom or something, or I spend my weekends with because I'm a hiker and I take the dog out, and what am I going to do without it? And maybe if we're not so defensive and reactive, we can think of a way to share that morning time, share that hiking time in the future, so that everybody benefits from this wonderful animal's presence in their lives.
There's so many possibilities, and I'm so grateful that we can bring awareness to this subject. So I like to finish off every one of our interviews with my favorite part, which is my top 3 tips. And so let's hear it from you. What would be your top 3 tips for families who are divorcing with a pet over whom they are having trouble resolving their dispute?
Well, of course, my first tip is when you get the pet, make sure you talk about how you're going to share them going forward. Now, someone might say, well, that's far off. And why would we talk about that? Because you still like each other, and the pet's going to benefit from that, and put it in writing. Please, God, don't just have the conversation over a glass of wine. Put it in writing and tuck it in a drawer. And what I call it is a touchstone. So you have this touchstone that says, this is why we bought this pet. This is what we expect from sharing this pet. And if something should happen, this is how we expect to share the pet going forward, because it will make life so much easier for you going forward. Second, make sure that if in fact you're going through divorce, if you can, my greatest tip is to find a mediator who's going to help you have this discussion in a positive manner. And finally, remember, your pet doesn't hate your ex. I know you do. And if you can remember that and understand that the pet would choose to be with your ex if you weren't around, that might be something that will enable you to be kinder and gentler going forward with respect to sharing the pet at some point with your ex.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for those 3 tips. And thank you, Debra, for joining us today on another episode of Healthy, Thriving Family After Divorce.
I'm grateful to be here. Thanks so much, Stephanie.
Yes. And thank you to our viewers for tuning in. Please check out our other episodes in our interview series, as well as all of the other positive and constructive resources and courses available in our membership community to help you to be empowered and to thrive in your journey moving from one home into 2. See you next time.